70,000 years ago, humanity was down to its last 10,000 individuals. A catastrophic event nearly wiped our species off the face of the Earth. Out of billions of potential genetic variations, we all descend from this tiny group of survivors, and the evidence for how close we came to extinction is written in your DNA right now. This is the story of humanity's darkest hour, and how, against all odds, we survived. Chapter 1: The Toba Catastrophe, the volcanic winter that nearly ended everything. Imagine waking up one morning and the sky is gone. Not cloudy, not dark, just gone. Replaced by a thick, suffocating blanket of ash that blocks out the sun completely. The temperature drops 30 degrees in a matter of weeks. Plants begin to die. Animals starve. And your small tribe of humans, already struggling to survive in the harsh prehistoric world, now faces a threat unlike anything your species has ever encountered. This isn't fiction. This actually happened. 74,000 years ago, a supervolcano on the island of Sumatra, in what is now Indonesia, exploded with a force that makes every volcanic eruption in recorded history look like a firecracker. The volcano was called Toba, and when it erupted, it nearly ended the human story before it really began. Let me put the scale of this eruption into perspective. When Mount St. Helens erupted in 1980, it was considered a massive volcanic event. It ejected 1 cubic kilometer of material. The 1991 eruption of Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines was even larger, ejecting 10 cubic kilometers of material and causing global temperatures to drop by half a degree Celsius for 2 years. Toba ejected 2,800 cubic kilometers of material. 2,800. That's not a typo. Toba was roughly 280 times more powerful than Pinatubo. It was the largest volcanic eruption in the last 25 million years. The explosion was so massive that it created a caldera, a collapsed volcanic crater that is now a lake 100 kilometers long and 30 kilometers wide. Lake Toba still exists today, a beautiful tourist destination that sits atop one of the most destructive forces in Earth's history. But the immediate explosion was just the beginning. When Toba erupted, it sent a column of ash and debris 40 kilometers into the atmosphere. That's well into the stratosphere, far higher than weather systems, where the ash could spread across the entire globe. Within weeks, the ash cloud had circled the Earth, blocking out sunlight and causing temperatures to plummet. This triggered what scientists call a volcanic winter. Without sunlight, plants couldn't photosynthesize. Without plants, herbivores starved. Without herbivores, carnivores starved. The entire food chain collapsed. And at the top of that food chain, barely hanging on, were our ancestors, Homo sapiens, modern humans, people who looked just like us, thought like us, felt love and fear and hope just like us. And they were dying. The volcanic winter lasted for 6 to 10 years. Imagine 6 years without a proper summer. 6 years of crops failing, if agriculture even existed in any form back then, which it didn't. 6 years of hunting animals that were themselves starving and dying off. 6 years of watching children freeze to death because there wasn't enough food to maintain body heat. But it gets worse. After the volcanic winter ended, the climate didn't just return to normal. The eruption triggered a 1,000-year ice age. 1,000 years of colder global temperatures, reduced rainfall, expanded glaciers, and hostile environments. Humanity was pushed to the absolute brink of extinction. We know this because of something called a genetic bottleneck. When scientists study human DNA, They can trace our ancestry backward through time by looking at genetic diversity. The more diverse our genes, the larger and more varied our ancient population was. The less diverse, the smaller our ancestral population. And human genetic diversity is remarkably low, lower than almost any other large mammal species on Earth, lower than chimpanzees, our closest relatives, lower than gorillas, lower than orangutans. We have less genetic variation than species with far smaller populations. This tells us that at some point in our past, the human population crashed dramatically. We went through what scientists call a population bottleneck, where our numbers dropped so low that we lost most of our genetic diversity. The survivors of this bottleneck became the ancestors of every human alive today. All 8 billion of us descend from a small group of maybe 10,000 to 15,000 individuals who survived the Toba catastrophe and the ice age that followed. 10,000 people. That's smaller than the population of most small towns. That's a sports stadium. That's a large university campus. That was all of humanity. Think about the implications of that. Every person you've ever met, every historical figure, every celebrity, every stranger on the street, we're all descendants of those 10,000 survivors. We're all incredibly closely related. We're all cousins, in the most literal genetic sense. The evidence for this bottleneck is overwhelming. When geneticists analyze mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down through the maternal line, they can trace all modern humans back to a small population living in Africa around 70,000 years ago, right at the time of the Toba eruption. When they analyze Y chromosome DNA passed down through the paternal line, they find the same pattern, a dramatic reduction in diversity around 70,000 years ago. When they analyze the entire human genome, the evidence is even clearer. We went through a severe population crash that brought us to the edge of extinction. But here's what's truly remarkable. We survived. Against all odds, in the face of the worst environmental catastrophe to hit the planet in millions of years, humanity held on. How did we do it? The answer lies in what makes us human. Our intelligence, our adaptability, our social bonds, our ability to innovate and problem solve in the face of impossible challenges. Let me take you back to Africa, 74,000 years ago, to the moment when Toba erupted. The humans living at that time wouldn't have known what was happening. They might have seen the sky darken over the course of days as the ash cloud spread. They would have noticed the temperature dropping. They would have watched as plants withered and animals grew scarce. They would have been terrified. Their entire world was ending, and they had no way to understand why. But they adapted. Archaeological evidence suggests that during this period, humans retreated to coastal regions, particularly in Africa. The coast offered several advantages. Marine resources like fish and shellfish were less affected by the volcanic winter than terrestrial plants and animals. Coastal areas had more stable temperatures moderated by the ocean, and caves along the coast provided shelter from the harsh conditions. One site in particular, Pinnacle Point in South Africa, has provided crucial evidence of human survival during the Toba event. Archaeologists have found evidence of human occupation there that spans the period of the eruption. These humans were eating shellfish, using sophisticated stone tools, and even using red ochre pigments, suggesting they maintained complex cultural behaviors even during the darkest times. They weren't just surviving, they were remaining human. They were creating art, maintaining social structures, passing knowledge to the next generation. This tells us something profound about our species. When faced with extinction, we don't just fight for physical survival. We fight to maintain our humanity, our culture, our identity. Other human species weren't so lucky. At the time of the Toba eruption, Homo sapiens wasn't the only human species on Earth. Neanderthals lived in Europe and Western Asia. Homo erectus still survived in parts of Asia. Denisovans occupied Eastern Asia. Multiple human species shared the planet. The Toba catastrophe may have contributed to the extinction of some of these species. While they survived the immediate aftermath, the long-term climatic changes may have pushed them past their ability to adapt. But Homo sapiens, our species, made it through. We were pushed to the very edge, reduced to a tiny population, hanging on in a few refuges. But we survived. And once we survived, once the climate began to stabilize around 65,000 years ago, we exploded outward. This is when the great human migration began. Small groups of humans left Africa and spread across the world. They moved into the Middle East, then Asia, then Europe. They crossed into Australia by boat, demonstrating remarkable seafaring abilities. They eventually made it to the Americas. Within just 40,000 years, humans had colonized every habitable continent on Earth. We went from nearly extinct to globally dominant. But the Toba bottleneck left its mark on us. That loss of genetic diversity has implications even today. Because we're all descended from such a small population, humans are remarkably genetically similar to each other. If you compare the DNA of two humans chosen randomly from anywhere in the world, they'll be 99.9% identical. The genetic differences between human populations are tiny compared to the variation you see in other species. This has profound implications for how we should think about race and ethnicity. The genetic differences between human populations are superficial, skin deep in the most literal sense. We're all recent descendants of the same small African population. The traits we use to categorize race, like skin color, are recent adaptations to different environments, evolved in just the last 60,000 years. We are, in the most fundamental genetic sense, one family, one species, one people. The Toba catastrophe taught us that. It reduced us to our essential core, stripped away everything except the will to survive. And in doing so, it showed us that humanity's strength lies not in our diversity of genes, but in our diversity of ideas, in our ability to work together, to share knowledge, to support each other through the darkest times. The survivors of Toba didn't make it alone. They survived because they had each other, because they shared food during famine, because they shared fire during the volcanic winter, because they taught their children how to craft tools and find water and identify edible plants. They survived because they were human, because they could imagine a future even when the present seemed hopeless, because they could tell stories around the fire, stories that gave meaning to suffering and purpose to survival. And those stories, that cultural knowledge, passed down through 74,000 years and 4,000 generations, eventually became us. Every technological innovation, every work of art, every scientific discovery, every act of compassion and courage, all of it traces back to those 10,000 survivors who refused to give up. We are their legacy. We are proof that they won. That humanity's story didn't end in ash and cold and starvation. That it continued, grew, flourished, and ultimately changed the entire planet. But the story of human survival doesn't end with Toba. That was just one moment, one catastrophe, one near-extinction event. Throughout our history, humanity has faced countless challenges that threatened to end us. And each time, we found a way through. Let me tell you about more of those moments, about the times when everything seemed lost, when extinction seemed inevitable, and yet, somehow, impossibly, we survived. Chapter 2. The Younger Dryas. When civilization nearly froze to death 12,800 years ago, humanity was doing well. Really well, actually. The last ice age was ending. Global temperatures had been rising for thousands of years. Ice sheets that once covered Canada and northern Europe were melting. New land was being exposed. Plants were spreading. Animals were thriving. And humans? We were on the verge of something revolutionary. Small groups of hunter-gatherers in the Fertile Crescent, that arc of land stretching from Egypt through the Levant to Mesopotamia, were experimenting with something new. They were planting seeds, cultivating crops, building permanent settlements. Agriculture was being born. Civilization was beginning. And then, suddenly, catastrophically, the climate collapsed. Within the span of a single human lifetime, maybe even faster, global temperatures plunged. The warming trend that had lasted thousands of years reversed. The ice sheets stopped melting and began advancing again. It was as if someone had hit the pause button on the end of the ice age and thrown Earth back into glacial conditions. This event is called the Younger Dryas, and it's one of the most dramatic climate shifts in Earth's recent history. The name comes from a flower, Dryas octopetala, an Arctic plant that thrives in cold conditions. When scientists analyzed pollen samples from this period, they found that Arctic plants suddenly appeared far south of where they should be, evidence that the climate had turned bitterly cold. But unlike the slow, gradual changes that typically characterize climate shifts, the Younger Dryas happened fast, terrifyingly fast. Ice core samples from Greenland show that in some regions, temperatures dropped 10 to 15 degrees Celsius in less than a decade. Some evidence suggests it could have been even faster, possibly in just a few years. Imagine that. Imagine living in a world that's getting warmer, where your parents and grandparents have told you stories of harder times, when the ice was closer and the winters were harsher. But for your whole life, things have been improving. The climate is mild. Food is plentiful. Your community is growing. And then, without warning, winter comes and doesn't leave. The snow that year doesn't melt. The crops you planted don't grow. The animals you depend on start moving south, following the retreating warmth. And the next year is worse. And the year after that is worse still. Within a generation, your entire world has changed. The permanent settlement your community built is now too cold to sustain. The agricultural experiments that were so promising now fail year after year. You have to go back to the old ways, back to nomadic hunting and gathering. But even that is harder, because the animals are scarce, and the plants are struggling. This is what happened to humans 12,800 years ago. Just as we were on the cusp of civilization, nature pulled the rug out from under us. The Younger Dryas lasted about 1,200 years. 1,200 years of reversed progress. 1,200 years of cold. 1,200 years of struggling to survive in a world that had turned hostile again. What caused it? For a long time, scientists weren't sure. The leading theory was that it had something to do with the melting ice sheets. As the massive glaciers covering North America melted, they released enormous amounts of fresh water into the oceans. This fresh water could have disrupted ocean currents, particularly the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, which is responsible for bringing warm water from the tropics to the North Atlantic. If that current shut down or significantly weakened, it would cause rapid cooling in the Northern Hemisphere. The tropical heat that normally warms Europe and North America would stay in the tropics, and the North would freeze. This theory, called the meltwater pulse hypothesis, explained a lot. It fit with the timing. It fit with the geographic pattern of cooling. It made sense. But in recent years, new evidence has emerged, suggesting something even more dramatic might have been involved. Some scientists now believe that the Younger Dryas was triggered by an extraterrestrial impact, a comet or asteroid that struck Earth or exploded in the atmosphere, causing massive destruction and rapid climate change. The evidence for this impact hypothesis is controversial but compelling. Researchers have found high concentrations of platinum in sediment layers dating to the start of the Younger Dryas. Platinum is rare on Earth's surface but common in asteroids and comets. They've found nanodiamonds, microscopic diamonds that form only under extreme pressure and temperature, such as from an impact. They've found spherules, tiny glass beads created when rock melts and cools rapidly, again consistent with an impact. They've found evidence of massive wildfires at the same time, as if large areas of forest had burned simultaneously. And they've found this evidence across North America, Europe, and even South America, suggesting a global event. The impact hypothesis proposes that a comet, perhaps 3 miles in diameter, broke apart as it entered Earth's atmosphere and exploded over North America. The explosions would have devastated the continent, starting wildfires, throwing dust into the atmosphere, and possibly triggering the shutdown of the Atlantic current by disrupting the ice sheets. If true, this would mean that civilization's first attempt at getting started was literally knocked down by a cosmic impact. The universe conspired against us, throwing a comet at Earth just as we were figuring out agriculture and permanent settlement. But whether it was caused by meltwater, or an impact, or some combination of factors, the result was the same. The Younger Dryas was a catastrophe for early human societies. Archaeological evidence shows that many of the nascent settlements in the Fertile Crescent were abandoned during this period. The people who had been experimenting with agriculture returned to nomadic lifestyles. Population declined. Social complexity decreased. But not everywhere. Some communities adapted. Some found ways to survive and even thrive during the Younger Dryas. And in doing so, they may have inadvertently accelerated the development of agriculture and civilization. Let me tell you about Göbekli Tepe. Göbekli Tepe is an archaeological site in southeastern Turkey, in what was once part of the Fertile Crescent. It was discovered in the 1960s, but wasn't properly excavated until the 1990s. And when archaeologists finally understood what they were looking at, it changed everything we thought we knew about early human civilization. Göbekli Tepe is a massive ceremonial complex. It consists of multiple circular structures, each made of enormous T-shaped limestone pillars, some weighing up to 20 tons. The pillars are decorated with intricate carvings of animals: lions, foxes, scorpions, snakes, birds. It's an architectural marvel. The engineering required to quarry these massive stones, transport them, and erect them is impressive, even by modern standards. The artistic skill evident in the carvings is extraordinary. But here's what makes Göbekli Tepe truly revolutionary. It was built 12,000 years ago, right at the beginning of the Younger Dryas, by hunter-gatherers who had not yet developed agriculture. Let me repeat that. This massive temple complex, this feat of engineering and art, was built by people who were still hunting animals and gathering wild plants for food. They hadn't domesticated crops yet. They hadn't built permanent villages yet. They were still, by all accounts, living a Stone Age lifestyle. Minus the villain. Except they weren't. They were building monuments. They were organizing labor. They were creating shared cultural symbols. They were, in essence, developing the social complexity necessary for civilization before they had developed the agricultural surplus usually thought necessary to support such complexity. Why would they do this? Why would hunter-gatherers expend so much effort building ceremonial structures? Some archaeologists believe the Younger Dryas itself might provide the answer. As the climate worsened, as resources became scarcer, different human groups would have been forced to cooperate more closely just to survive. They needed to organize larger communal hunts. They needed to share information about where food could be found. They needed social structures to manage conflict and ensure fair distribution of resources. Göbekli Tepe might have been a gathering place, a neutral ground where different groups could come together, share food, trade goods, arrange marriages, and participate in religious ceremonies that reinforced social bonds. And in doing so, in creating these shared social institutions, they were building the foundations of civilization even as the climate tried to tear them down. There's another possibility, one that's even more intriguing. Some researchers have suggested that the stress of the Younger Dryas didn't just encourage cooperation, it actually pushed humans to develop agriculture. Think about it. During the good times, when wild resources were plentiful, why would you bother with the hard work of farming? Hunting and gathering provided a varied diet with less labor. You could move around, following the seasons in the game. Life was, in many ways, easier. But during the Younger Dryas, wild resources became unreliable. The climate was unstable. Some years were worse than others. You couldn't depend on finding enough food through hunting and gathering alone. So you started supplementing. You started planting seeds of the wild grains you gathered, ensuring you'd have a supply the next year. You started tending to certain plants, weeding around them, protecting them from animals. You started staying in one place longer to tend your proto-crops. At first, it was just insurance, a backup plan. But over generations, as you got better at it, as you selected the best seeds and developed techniques, it became your primary food source. Agriculture might have been born out of desperation during the Younger Dryas. It might have been a survival strategy developed by people facing climate catastrophe. If true, this means that one of humanity's greatest innovations, the development of agriculture that allowed all subsequent civilization to emerge, was a direct response to near-extinction conditions. We became farmers because the climate tried to kill us. The Younger Dryas ended about 11,600 years ago. The climate shifted again, this time back to warming. The ice retreated, temperatures rose, and the world entered the Holocene, the current geological epoch, characterized by stable, warm conditions. And in that stability, the agricultural experiments of the Younger Dryas took off. Within just a few thousand years, farming had spread across the Fertile Crescent, into Europe, into Asia, into Africa. Independent agricultural revolutions occurred in China, Mesoamerica, and the Andes. Permanent settlements grew into villages, villages into towns, towns into cities. Writing was invented. Metalworking was developed. Trade networks expanded. Empires rose. Civilization, in all its complexity and glory, emerged from the ashes of the Younger Dryas. The 10,000 survivors of Toba had become millions by the time of the Younger Dryas. Those millions had built the foundations of civilization during the cold. And when the warm Holocene began, they were ready. They had the social organization, the technology, and the knowledge necessary to create the complex societies that would eventually become ancient Sumer, Egypt, the Indus Valley Civilization, China. All of human history, everything that came after, was built on the resilience shown during those 1,200 years of cold. But the Younger Dryas wasn't the last time climate threatened civilization. Throughout history, small changes in temperature and rainfall patterns have toppled empires and forced mass migrations. Let me tell you about some of those moments, because they reveal something important about our relationship with the environment and about how fragile even advanced civilizations can be. Chapter 3. The Bronze Age Collapse. When the world burned. When the world burned. 3,200 years ago, the Eastern Mediterranean was home to the most advanced civilizations on Earth. This was the height of the Bronze Age, and the region was a network of powerful kingdoms and empires that traded with each other, fought with each other, and formed a complex international system that rivaled anything seen before in human history. The Hittite Empire controlled Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, from their capital at Hattusa. They were master metallurgists and fierce warriors. The Egyptian New Kingdom, under the reign of powerful pharaohs like Ramesses II, controlled the Nile Valley and extended its influence into the Levant. The Mycenaean Greeks, the civilization that would later be romanticized in Homer's Iliad, controlled mainland Greece and much of the Aegean. The Assyrians were building an empire in Mesopotamia. The Minoans, though past their peak, still inhabited Crete. City-states dotted the Levantine coast, growing rich from trade. These civilizations had writing. They had bureaucracies. They had professional armies. They built palaces and temples and ships. They traded tin from Afghanistan, copper from Cyprus, grain from Egypt, olive oil from Greece, cedar from Lebanon. They sent letters to each other. We've found diplomatic correspondence written in cuneiform on clay tablets, letters between pharaohs and kings discussing marriages between royal families, trade agreements, military alliances. This was a cosmopolitan, interconnected world. It was, in many ways, the first globalized system. And then, within the span of about 50 years, it all came crashing down. Around 1200 BCE, the Bronze Age civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean collapsed, not declined, not gradually weakened, collapsed, catastrophically, violently, completely. The Hittite Empire fell. Their capital, Hattusa, was burned and abandoned. The empire that had rivaled Egypt simply ceased to exist. Mycenaean palaces across Greece were destroyed. The writing system was lost. Greek society reverted to a pre-literate state that would last 400 years, a period historians call the Greek Dark Ages. Cities along the Levantine coast were burned. Archaeological evidence shows layers of ash and destruction. Even Egypt, the most stable and long-lived of the Bronze Age civilizations, barely survived. They repelled invasions, but lost control of their foreign territories and entered a long period of decline. The trade networks collapsed. The sophisticated international system disintegrated. Population declined dramatically. Many areas were completely depopulated. What happened? For a long time, historians blamed something called the Sea Peoples. Ancient Egyptian texts mention invasions by mysterious groups from the sea, coalitions of different peoples who attacked Egypt and other kingdoms. The pharaoh Ramesses III fought them off, but barely, and the inscriptions describe massive battles and desperate defense. But who were the Sea Peoples? Where did they come from? Why did they suddenly appear and attack all at once? The texts don't tell us. They give names for some of the groups, names like the Peliset and the Tijaker and the Shekelesh. But we don't know who these people really were or where they originated. For decades, the Sea Peoples were blamed for the collapse. It was framed as an invasion, a migration of barbarians who overwhelmed the civilized world. But more recent research has revealed a more complex and more terrifying truth. The Bronze Age collapse wasn't caused by invaders. It was caused by systemic failure. The entire interconnected system of Bronze Age civilizations, so sophisticated and powerful, was actually incredibly fragile. And when it faced multiple stresses simultaneously, it shattered. Let me explain. The Bronze Age civilizations depended on bronze. Bronze is an alloy of copper and tin. Copper was relatively common, found in Cyprus, the Sinai, and other locations. But tin was rare. The main source of tin for the Eastern Mediterranean was Afghanistan, over 2,000 miles away. This means that to make bronze, to make the tools and weapons their societies depended on, these civilizations needed functioning long-distance trade networks. They needed caravans traveling thousands of miles. They needed ships crossing the Mediterranean. They needed stable kingdoms along the routes to protect traders. The system worked beautifully when everything was stable, but it was vulnerable to disruption. And around 1200 BCE, everything went wrong at once. First, there's evidence of severe drought. Climate records from sediment cores and tree rings show that the Eastern Mediterranean experienced a prolonged period of reduced rainfall starting around 1200 BCE and lasting decades. Drought meant crop failures. Crop failures meant famine. Famine meant social unrest. We have texts from this period that mention hunger, grain shortages, and desperate requests for food aid. The king of the Hittites wrote to the king of Ugarit, a city-state on the Syrian coast, begging for grain shipments. The king of Ugarit wrote back that he had no grain to send because his own people were starving. Second, there's evidence of earthquakes. The Eastern Mediterranean sits on multiple fault lines, and geological evidence suggests a period of increased seismic activity around this time. Several Bronze Age cities show evidence of destruction consistent with earthquakes rather than warfare. Earthquakes would have destroyed cities, disrupted trade, and added to the chaos. Third, the political situation was destabilizing. The major powers had been fighting expensive wars with each other for decades. Egypt and the Hittites had fought a massive battle at Kadesh, one of the largest chariot battles in history, which ended in a stalemate. The wars drained resources and weakened both empires. Fourth, there may have been invasions or migrations from groups outside the civilized zone. The Sea Peoples might have been refugees, fleeing drought and famine in their own lands, becoming raiders out of desperation. Or they might have been groups from within the collapsing system itself, people who had been displaced, who had lost everything, who banded together and attacked the remaining centers of wealth. And fifth, there's evidence that the lower classes, the farmers and laborers and soldiers who supported the palatial economies, may have revolted. When famine came and the palaces couldn't provide food, when the trade systems broke down and the elites couldn't deliver on their promises, people stopped supporting the system. Why should a farmer give his grain to the palace when his own children are starving? Why should a soldier fight for a king who can't pay him? Archaeological evidence from destroyed palaces shows that in many cases, the destruction came from within. The palaces were burned, but the weapons and valuables were gone, taken. This looks less like conquest and more like revolt and looting. All of these factors, drought, earthquakes, war, invasion, and revolt, created a cascading collapse. Each problem made the others worse. Drought caused famine, which caused social unrest, which made kingdoms less able to defend trade routes, which disrupted tin supplies, which made it harder to produce bronze, which weakened armies, which made kingdoms vulnerable to invasion, which caused more disruption, which led to more famine, and so on. The system, so interconnected and sophisticated, couldn't handle simultaneous shocks. It was too complex, too interdependent. When one part failed, it pulled everything else down with it. Within a few generations, the Bronze Age world was gone. Cities were abandoned, trade ceased, writing was forgotten in many areas, population declined drastically. The survivors scattered. Some migrated to new areas. Others retreated to subsistence farming in small villages. The cosmopolitan world of international trade and diplomacy was replaced by isolated, impoverished communities struggling to survive. It would take centuries for the region to recover. When it did, when the Iron Age civilizations eventually emerged, they would be different. They would use iron instead of bronze, a metal that didn't require long-distance trade because iron ore was more common. They would develop new social structures, new political systems. The Greeks of the Iron Age would eventually create democracy and philosophy. The Phoenicians would spread alphabetic writing. The Assyrians would build a new empire, but one structured differently from the Bronze Age kingdoms. The Bronze Age collapse was a catastrophe, but it was also a reset. It destroyed an old world and created space for a new one to emerge. But here's the important question. Could it happen again? Look at our modern world. We're more interconnected than ever before. We depend on global supply chains for everything from food to medicine to electronics. A chip manufactured in Taiwan using materials from a dozen countries becomes part of a phone assembled in China and sold in New York. We depend on stable climate patterns for agriculture. We depend on fossil fuels, extracted in one place, refined in another, and used everywhere. We depend on complex financial systems that span the globe. What happens if that system faces multiple simultaneous shocks? What happens if climate change causes droughts and crop failures in multiple breadbaskets at once? What happens if a pandemic disrupts supply chains, or a major war cuts off trade, or a solar storm knocks out satellite systems, or financial contagion spreads? The Bronze Age collapse teaches us that complexity is fragile, that interconnected systems can fail catastrophically when stressed, that civilization can disappear faster than it's built. We need to learn from the past. We need to build resilience, not just efficiency. We need redundancy, not just optimization. We need to ensure that our systems can survive shocks, because shocks will come. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And right now, our global civilization is humming along, confident in its permanence, just as the Bronze Age kingdoms once were. Let's hope we're smarter than they were. Chapter 4. The Plague of Justinian. When disease nearly ended civilization, 541 years after the birth of Christ, in the great city of Constantinople, capital of the Roman Empire, that still called itself Roman, even though Rome itself had fallen a century before, death came in the form of fleas. The Plague of Justinian, named after the Byzantine Emperor Justinian I, who ruled during its outbreak, was the first recorded pandemic of bubonic plague. It would kill between 30 and 50 million people over the next 2 centuries, roughly half the population of the known world. It was the deadliest pandemic in human history until the Black Death 800 years later, and it came terrifyingly close to ending Mediterranean civilization entirely. Let me tell you what it was like. The plague arrived in Constantinople in the spring of 541, brought by merchant ships from Egypt. At first, it seemed like just another outbreak of disease. Unpleasant, but not unusual. Cities in the ancient world regularly dealt with epidemics. But this was different. Within weeks, people were dying by the thousands. Within months, tens of thousands. The symptoms were horrific. Victims developed buboes, swollen lymph nodes in the groin, armpits, and neck that turned black and leaked pus. High fevers, delirium, vomiting, and then, usually, death. The mortality rate was astounding. Estimates suggest that at the peak of the outbreak in Constantinople, 10,000 people were dying every day. 10,000. Every single day. The city couldn't handle it. There weren't enough people to bury the dead. Bodies piled up in the streets, in houses, in public buildings. The stench was overwhelming. The psychological impact was devastating. We have eyewitness accounts from Procopius, a historian who lived through the plague in Constantinople. His descriptions are nightmarish. He describes how the death toll became so high that they ran out of space to bury people. They filled every available tomb, every cemetery. Then, they started digging mass graves. When those filled up, they began stuffing bodies into the towers of the city walls, packing them in and sealing the towers shut. The smell of rotting corpses permeated the entire city. He describes how people stopped leaving their homes out of fear, how markets closed, how trade ceased, how the city, one of the great metropolises of the world, home to 500,000 people, became a ghost town. He describes how people became numb to death, how losing family members became so common that it lost its emotional impact, how survival became pure luck, random chance, because no one understood how the disease spread or how to avoid it. Emperor Justinian himself caught the plague. He survived, one of the lucky few, but the experience changed him. He had been an ambitious emperor, planning to reconquer the lost western territories of the Roman Empire to restore Rome's glory. After the plague, those plans faltered. How do you conquer new territory when your own empire is collapsing from disease? The plague didn't stay in Constantinople. It spread throughout the Mediterranean, following trade routes carried by ships and caravans. It hit Egypt, Syria, Palestine, Greece, Italy, Gaul, Spain, North Africa. It spread into Persia, the great rival empire to the east. It spread north into the Balkans and beyond. Everywhere it went, it killed roughly half the population. Think about that. Half. Not the old and weak, though they died too. Half of everyone. Young, old, healthy, sick. The disease didn't discriminate. The economic impact was catastrophic. With half the workforce dead, agricultural production collapsed. Fields went unplowed. Crops rotted unharvested. Famine followed plague. Tax revenues plummeted. The government couldn't pay its soldiers or its bureaucrats. The army shrank. The administration weakened. Trade collapsed. Why send ships across the Mediterranean if half the merchants are dead and half the customers are gone? Cities depopulated. Some were abandoned entirely. Archaeological evidence shows major urban centers being reduced to villages or empty ruins. The social fabric tore apart. Traditional structures broke down. Who cares about social hierarchy when everyone is dying? Who follows laws when there's no one to enforce them? And in the chaos, in the wake of so much death, people looked for explanations. They looked for someone to blame. Christians blamed pagans, saying the plague was God's punishment for insufficient piety. Pagans blamed Christians, saying the new religion had angered the old gods. Both blamed Jews, because religious minorities always get blamed during crises. There were pogroms, massacres, violence born of fear and desperation, and the very human need to make sense of senseless suffering. The plague would recur in waves for the next 200 years. Just when populations started to recover, it would flare up again. 541 to 750. Wave after wave of death. Each recurrence killed more people, weakened civilization further, made recovery harder. By the time the Plague of Justinian finally burned itself out in the mid-8th century, the Mediterranean world was transformed. The Byzantine Empire, which had been on the verge of reconquering the lost Western territories, was weakened permanently. It would never again threaten to restore the old Roman Empire. In the West, the former Roman territories were now fully controlled by Germanic kingdoms. The classical world was over. The medieval world was beginning. And in Arabia, in the power vacuum left by the weakened Byzantine and Persian empires, a new religion had emerged: Islam. Within a century of the plague's end, Muslim armies would conquer half the Mediterranean, creating a new empire that would dominate the region for centuries. The Plague of Justinian changed the course of history. It ended the classical world and enabled the medieval world. It weakened Christianity's dominant position and allowed Islam to spread. It depopulated cities and shifted power to rural areas. It impoverished economies and weakened states, all because of bacteria. Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium that would cause the Black Death 800 years later. But here's what's truly important to understand. The Plague of Justinian was preventable, not with 6th century technology, obviously. They didn't have antibiotics or an understanding of germ theory. From their perspective, the plague was an unstoppable force of nature or divine punishment. But it was neither. It was a bacterial infection transmitted by fleas that lived on rats, and rats thrived in the conditions created by human civilization. The plague spread along trade routes because ships carried rats. It thrived in cities because cities were densely populated and often had poor sanitation, creating perfect habitats for rats. The very things that made civilization powerful, cities and trade, also made it vulnerable to pandemic disease. This is a pattern we see throughout history. Disease follows civilization. The more connected we are, the faster disease spreads. The more densely we live, the easier transmission becomes. The Plague of Justinian, the Black Death, smallpox in the Americas, the Spanish flu, COVID-19. Each pandemic is different in its details, but the underlying pattern is the same. Human civilization creates the conditions for pandemics, and then pandemics threaten civilization. It's a terrible irony. The same innovations that allow us to thrive, cities, trade, travel, also create our greatest vulnerabilities. And each time, we're forced to choose. Do we isolate, closing borders and shutting down trade, protecting ourselves but abandoning the connections that make us strong? Or do we stay connected, maintaining civilization but accepting the spread of disease? There's no easy answer. Both choices have costs. During the Plague of Justinian, some cities tried to isolate themselves. They closed their gates, turned away ships, refused to trade. Some of these cities survived with lower death tolls, but they also suffered economically. They weakened themselves in other ways. Other cities stayed open, maintaining trade and connection. They paid a terrible price in lives lost. But some of them recovered faster after the plague ended because they had maintained their economic networks. The Plague of Justinian lasted 2 centuries. Multiple generations lived their entire lives under the shadow of recurring plague. Children grew up knowing that any year could be a plague year, that friends and family could die suddenly, that survival was random. How do you build a civilization under those conditions? How do you plan for the future when the future is so uncertain? Yet people did. They adapted. They survived. They maintained their cultures, their religions, their identities. They passed knowledge to the next generation. They built and created and loved and hoped. Even in the darkest times, humans find ways to keep going. The plague eventually ended. We don't know exactly why. It might have been evolution, the bacteria becoming less virulent, or humans developing resistance. It might have been environmental changes that reduced rat populations. It might have been pure luck, but it ended. And when it did, civilization rebuilt. The medieval world that emerged from the ashes of the Plague of Justinian was different from the classical world that preceded it, but it was still civilization. Still humans, working together, building, creating, striving for something better. We survived. We always survive. The question is, at what cost?